And greetings, friends. Today I want to talk to you about Galatians, the 4th chapter, verses 8 through 10, where the Apostle Paul here is addressing the Galatians, and many people take these passages to mean that those who keep God's holy days, the Passover, the days of unleavened bread, the Feast of Tabernacles, weeks, Day of Atonement, Feast of Trumpets, and so on, the festivals that you find in Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, many people take this to mean that we don't have to keep these days any longer, that the Apostle Paul calls them weak and beggarly elements, and that we shouldn't keep them anymore. And a lot of people use these verses and other verses in the book of Galatians to try and prove that we don't have to keep God's law, that God's law is done away. Now, I've often said in these Bible misconception programs that a lot of people just take one verse and then automatically put their interpretation into it and automatically say that we don't have to keep the feast days of Almighty God. They quote verse 10, which says you observe days and months and times and years. And in verse 9, it calls them the weak and beggarly elements. And automatically they say that means God's holy days. They forget the context. They just lift it out of its context and automatically say it's God's holy days. Well, is that true? Well, let's go into the Bible, into the book of Galatians, the 4th chapter, and let's see what the context is. And when we get the context, then we can understand who the Apostle Paul is addressing here in this letter. Verse 8, it starts, "Howbeit then, when ye knew not God, you did service unto them which by nature are no gods." That's idolatry. Who is the Apostle Paul talking to here? Well, Barnes notes, his commentary says, the address in this verse and the following is evidently to the portion of the Galatians who had been pagan. These were people that worship gods like Zeus, Apollos, Venus, and so on. These people, before they became Christian, were pagan and worship pagan gods. That's the context. Now that we understand the context, we can understand what he's saying in the next two passages. He says, but now, right now, these people are Christian now, but now, after that ye have known God, or rather are known of God, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage? Turn again to what? To their former life, which is what? Paganism. And the Apostle Paul calls it the weak and beggarly elements. And he calls it bondage. What is bondage? Notice what he says here in Romans, the 7th chapter, verse 23. He says, I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, bringing me into captivity, that's bondage, to the law of sin, which is in my members. Jesus Christ said in John the 8th chapter, verse 34, he that commits sin is a slave of sin. Bondage is sin. And what is sin? 1 John 3:4, sin is the transgression of the law. Breaking the law is sin, and that is bondage. And keeping the law, as James says in his letter, that God's law is the law of liberty, freedom from sin. So, here the Apostle Paul is speaking about the weak and beggarly elements whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage. Speaking of idolatry, paganism, and sin. Verse 10, then he says, ye observe days and months and times and years. Well, what is he speaking of? Well, he's not speaking about God's festivals. He's not speaking about God's law. He's speaking of the former pagan festivals that they used to celebrate before they became Christian. And, of course, also the times, the way they used to observe times and years on their calendar. He's speaking of paganism. He's speaking of pagan festivals, pagan observances. He's not speaking about God's law. He's not speaking about God's festivals. So that is the context. The Apostle Paul says that these Galatian people should not turn back to paganism, of worshiping pagan idols, of observing pagan festivals and times. And he says here that they are now servants of Almighty God, and that they are heirs of God through Christ, verse 7. So to say that these passages in Galatians, the 4th chapter, proves that we don't have to keep the festivals of Almighty God anymore is just another Bible misconception.